The storm had been tearing through the sky for hours, a relentless fury of wind and rain that seemed to echo the chaos brewing within the group of survivors huddled on the edge of the shoreline. Lightning flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows across the turbulent waters, revealing glimpses of a shadowy silhouette jutting from the depths, a dark, jagged form that defied explanation. It was as if the storm itself had summoned some ancient nightmare from the abyss, forcing them to confront not only the fury of nature, but something far darker lurking beneath the surface. Their boat, battered and exhausted, barely held together, trembling with each thunderclap as they stared in disbelief at the submerged structure rising from the chaos. It looked like a temple, ancient and forbidding, its silhouette jagged and irregular, as if carved by some forgotten, violent hand. No one knew how long it had been underwater or why it had suddenly emerged now, but everyone felt the weight of an unspoken dread pressing on their chest, tightening with every heartbeat. They had survived the storm, barely, yet what awaited them was no longer a matter of weather or chance. It was something else, an encounter with the unknown that defied logic and shattered their sense of reality. The air grew thick with a strange, suffocating silence as they approached the water's edge, drawn inexplicably toward the dark shadow that loomed like a trap set by some malevolent force. The wind seemed to whisper warnings, but they were drowned out by their own pounding hearts and the distant, unnatural hum that grew louder with each step toward the submerged entrance. The water, churning violently, beckoned them to enter, as if it knew that their fate depended on what lay hidden beneath its surface. There was an undeniable pull, a sense that crossing into the depths would unleash something that could never be contained or understood. As they finally stepped onto the slippery stones leading into the temple's shadowed maw, the world around them seemed to shift. The storm outside had become a distant memory, replaced by an oppressive silence, punctuated only by the sound of their own breathing, each inhale sharp, each exhale shallow. Inside, the corridors twisted and folded in impossible ways, like a living nightmare made solid. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, shifting subtly with every heartbeat, reflecting their deepest fears and unresolved traumas. The air grew colder, thicker, as if reality itself was bleeding away, leaving only the fragile veneer of sanity. Every step they took echoed with a hollow, dissonant sound, as if the very fabric of the building was mocking their efforts to find truth or escape. The darkness within the temple felt alive, watching, waiting, a predator that fed on their doubts, their guilt, and their terror. They soon realized that this was no ordinary place. It was a mirror of their nightmares, a labyrinth crafted by some unseen intelligence that thrived on their suffering. The corridors seemed to breathe, to shift when they weren't looking, trapping them in a perpetual state of disorientation. Shadows flickered at the edge of their vision, whispering secrets only their minds could hear, gnawing at their sanity. Every corner seemed to hide a truth they were unwilling to face, secrets about themselves, about what they had lost, or what they feared most. The more they explored, the more the boundaries between what was real and what was imagined blurred, until they could no longer tell if they were running from a monster or their own minds. It was as if the temple had become a living extension of their subconscious, a place where nightmares took form and refused to let go. What they couldn't ignore was the growing sense of something watching, something feeding on their despair. An unseen force, ancient and insatiable, lurked within the shadows, gaining strength with each moment of their fear. It was subtle at first, faint whispers, fleeting shapes, moments where reality flickered like a dying light. But it grew bolder, more tangible, feeding on their despair and anxieties, twisting their perceptions and amplifying their inner darkness. They felt it pressing against their minds, clawing at the edges of their sanity, promising salvation yet delivering only horror. The realization dawned slowly. This was not just about surviving the storm outside, but about confronting the storm within. The fears, guilt, and shame they carried like invisible scars. The temple wasn't just a trap, it was a mirror of the human soul, distorted and corrupted, revealing how fragile and vulnerable they truly were when faced with the darkness lurking beneath the surface. As nightmarish as their journey would become, they sensed that the only way out was to face what haunted them most, an inward battle that might cost them everything, including their sanity. The ancient temple was more than a ruin. It was a living, breathing entity, feeding on their fears and threatening to consume their very essence. And with every step deeper into the labyrinth, they understood that their fight was not only against the darkness outside, but also the darkness within, a terrifying realization that their salvation might come at the price of their souls. Within the oppressive silence of the temple's corridors, the true horror begins to reveal itself, not as a monstrous entity lurking in shadows, but as an insidious force that manipulates perception, eroding the very foundation of identity. Consider how the mind, when pushed to its limits, can become a battleground, where reality is no longer a fixed point, but a fluid, shifting terrain. In this environment, the survivor's sense of self becomes vulnerable to infiltration as memories distort and emotions fracture under the relentless pressure. The creature's power lies not solely in its ability to manifest nightmares, but in its capacity to distort the fabric of consciousness, turning internal fears into external manifestations that seem tangible and unstoppable. It's as if the boundaries between thought and reality dissolve, leaving behind a fractured mosaic of what once was certainty. This manipulation of perception extends beyond mere hallucination. It acts as a mirror, reflecting the deepest fissures within each individual. When faced with existential dread, the mind instinctively seeks anchors, memories, beliefs, or routines that provide a semblance of stability. Yet in the temple's domain, these anchors are systematically dismantled. Memories become unreliable, warped by the entity's influence, and beliefs are challenged by visions that seem to contradict everything the survivor holds true. Now, consider how this mirrors the real-world experience of trauma, how the mind, when overwhelmed, begins to question its own recollections, losing trust in what once seemed immutable. The temple amplifies this internal chaos, turning the survivors' doubts into tangible threats, as the environment itself seems to mock their uncertainty, whispering false truths that threaten to unravel their sense of reality completely. Furthermore, the psychological torment inflicted by this unseen force is designed to strip away hope, replacing it with despair that manifests as visceral physical sensations. The sensation of suffocation, the pounding of a relentless heartbeat in the ears, the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, these are not merely sensations, but tools wielded to break the spirit. When the mind perceives danger, it naturally responds with heightened alertness. But here, that alertness becomes a trap. The survivors' heightened senses are exploited to deepen their paranoia, making every shadow a potential predator, every whisper a symptom of their own unraveling. Mind. This relentless barrage blurs the line between external threat and internal collapse, forcing them to confront the terrifying possibility that the greatest enemy resides within. Now, reflect on how this internal invasion challenges the very concept of control. Within the temple's labyrinth, agency is an illusion. Every choice, every path is subtly manipulated to serve the unknowable intelligence feeding off their fears. The corridors seem to respond to their mental state, twisting and elongating when they falter, collapsing when they cling too tightly to certainty. It's as if the environment itself is a sentient reflection of their subconscious, capable of adapting to their deepest weaknesses. Now think how this applies when you face personal crises, how fears of inadequacy, guilt, or regret can dominate your thoughts, making it difficult to see beyond the immediate threat. The temple's design demonstrates that when the mind is vulnerable, even the most stable external reality can become a suffocating labyrinth that traps and consumes. Another profound layer emerges when considering how the entity derives strength from emotional vulnerability. It does not simply hunt for physical manifestations of terror, but feeds on the energy generated by hopelessness, shame, and self-doubt. This energy acts like a fuel, intensifying its influence and expanding its reach. Imagine a parasite that thrives on despair, growing larger with every scream of terror and every cry of helplessness. Now picture how this dynamic operates in daily life. Unresolved guilt or suppressed fears, when left unchecked, can fester and throb, draining your vitality and clouding judgment. The temple's grotesque power lies in its ability to amplify this process, turning internal wounds into external monsters. It demonstrates that the most insidious threats aren't always visible, but are instead rooted deeply in the emotional vulnerabilities we often neglect, which, when exploited, can become our undoing. Finally, consider the implications of confronting these inner horrors as a prerequisite for survival. It's not enough to outrun or hide. The survivor must face the relentless truth of their own darkness. The temple demands that they peer into the abyss within, to acknowledge their fears, guilt, and shame candidly, an act that is both a surrender and a form of confrontation. This process is excruciating because it exposes the fragile, imperfect core of their humanity, revealing that beneath the veneer of strength lies a vulnerable consciousness easily shattered. The creature's true power is revealed in this moment. It does not just seek to kill or terrify, but to obliterate the survivor's sense of self entirely. To resist, then, is to accept that inner darkness must be brought into the light, no matter how terrifying or destructive that revelation may be. In this way, the temple becomes a crucible for psychological transformation, forcing each individual to confront not only the external monstrosity, but also the internal shadows they desperately try to suppress. The process of facing these fears is akin to willing a descent into chaos, where the only way back is through acceptance of the terror's truth. Yet this acceptance comes at a steep price. It risks shattering the survivor's remaining sense of coherence, leaving them forever altered. The question lingers, can the human mind withstand such profound revelation without succumbing to the abyss Or does the very act of confronting these horrors guarantee that they will carry the darkness within them, forever transformed into shadows that may someday rise again? The temple's true horror lies not solely in what it reveals, but in its uncanny ability to expose the fragile, flickering core of human resilience, an illusion that, once broken, leaves only the haunting realization that some fears are never truly conquerable, only manageable or endured. Building on this, however, the true horror lies in the realization that the temple's influence extends beyond immediate perception, infiltrating the very fabric of their subconscious. Each survivor's mind becomes a landscape fertile for the creature's seed, an echo chamber where unspoken fears grow wild, unchecked. What's insidious is how these internal landscapes subtly reshape their reactions, twisting instinct into paralysis or aggression. For some, the fear manifests as an obsessive need to find safety in familiar routines, only to discover that what once comforted them now morphs into a source of dread. Their mental defenses, once thought robust, crumble under the weight of the entity's manipulation, exposing vulnerabilities they never knew existed. The temple doesn't merely prey on surface anxieties, it penetrates deeply, exploiting the nervous system of the psyche, turning memories into weapons against themselves. Furthermore, the influence of this unseen force reveals a disturbing truth about the nature of human weakness, the ease with which hope can be extinguished and replaced by despair. When facing such a relentless psychological assault, survivors often default to denial, clinging to illusions of control amid chaos. Yet this denial serves only as a fragile veneer, a thin barrier that the temple's influence erodes gradually. The more they deny their fears, the more potent the creature's grip becomes, feeding on their resistance and turning it into fuel for its insidious growth. It becomes a paradoxical cycle. The harder they fight to preserve their mental integrity, the faster it deteriorates. Analogous to a delicate glass shattering under increasing pressure, their minds fracture, exposing jagged fissures of terror that threaten to splinter their entire sense of self. Another crucial layer emerges when considering how the environment itself acts as a reflection of their internal disintegration. The shifting corridors are not arbitrary, they are an externalization of mental chaos. As the survivors' fears intensify, walls ripple or dissolve, revealing glimpses of their own worst nightmares made tangible. For instance, a survivor haunted by guilt over a lost loved one might find the walls bleeding with spectral memories, each whisper echoing accusations they cannot escape. Meanwhile, someone battling shame might see their reflection distorted into a grotesque caricature, mocking their perceived flaws. The corridors become a dynamic mirror, constantly adapting to their emotional vulnerabilities, ensuring that escape is impossible without confronting the very darkness they desperately wish to deny. The environment is no longer passive, but actively complicit, amplifying their torment at every turn. Now consider how the creature's feeding mechanism mirrors the broader human tendency to internalize suffering. It derives vitality from emotional energy, fear, shame, regret, like a vampire draining blood to sustain itself. When a survivor succumbs to hopelessness, they inadvertently serve as a conduit, channeling their despair directly into the creature's growth. This symbiotic relationship reveals a chilling truth. The more someone resists or suppresses their fears outwardly, the more they internalize and magnify them inwardly. The act of repressing pain becomes a kind of self-inflicted wound, a fertile ground for the entity's hunger. It underscores how internal conflicts, if left unresolved, can spiral into internal monsters, which then manifest externally in the form of the temple's shifting labyrinth and relentless darkness. Another perspective to explore is how the survivors' fractured perceptions distort their moral compass, forcing them into choices that blur the line between right and wrong. As their mental state deteriorates, acts of self-preservation become increasingly desperate and morally ambiguous. Some may betray others to escape, sacrificing their humanity in exchange for fleeting safety. Others might succumb entirely to paranoia, turning on their companions in a misguided effort to survive. The temple's influence strips away the veneer of civility, revealing primal instincts that had been suppressed by social norms. This descent into moral chaos emphasizes that in the face of insurmountable horror, the boundaries that once defined human decency become porous, revealing a darker truth. Survival may demand the abandonment of one's own conscience. It raises profound questions about the nature of morality, whether it is an inherent truth or merely a fragile construct easily shattered by fear. Lastly, the understanding that the creature feeds not just on fear, but on surrender, reveals a sobering insight. Resistance itself can be a double-edged sword. When a survivor pushes against the darkness, they generate adrenaline and resolve, temporary shields that obscure the depth of dread. Yet these acts of defiance can inadvertently energize the entity, which interprets resistance as validation of its power. Conversely, accepting one's terror without resistance can paradoxically weaken the creature's hold, allowing the survivor to momentarily reclaim agency in their internal chaos. It is akin to a delicate dance, balancing acknowledgement of vulnerability with the strength to endure it. This nuanced dynamic exposes the complex interplay between yielding and fighting. How surrender can sometimes be an act of courage, a recognition of limits rather than outright defeat. Ultimately, it challenges the notion that victory in such a realm is achieved through strength alone. Instead, it hinges on understanding how to navigate the labyrinth of the mind without succumbing to its darkest corners. When the boundaries between perception and reality dissolve, the creature's influence extends into the very fabric of how survivors interpret their surroundings. Now consider how the mind constructs meaning based on sensory input, what it perceives as safe, threatening, or familiar. The temple's shifting architecture exploits this reliance, manipulating sensory cues to distort their understanding of space and time. Hallways stretch into impossible lengths, doors appear and vanish at will, and familiar objects warp into grotesque caricatures. These distortions aren't random. They're tailored to each individual's deepest insecurities. For someone haunted by abandonment, a corridor might close in, trapping them with memories of betrayal. For another overwhelmed by guilt, a mirror might reveal a distorted reflection of their worst failure. The environment becomes a personalized nightmare, a tailored maze that constantly tests their capacity to reconcile perception with internal truth. Furthermore, the manipulation of sensory information extends into emotional states, creating a feedback loop that deepens their vulnerability. When a survivor's sense of safety is shattered, their fight-or-flight response is triggered, flooding their system with adrenaline and cortisol. These chemicals heighten their awareness, but also cloud judgment, making them more susceptible to hallucinations or false perceptions. As their nervous system spirals into overload, even the smallest inconsistency, like a flickering shadow or a distant whisper, can be misconstrued as imminent danger. This amplification of paranoia diminishes their ability to distinguish real threats from imagined ones, effectively turning their own heightened alertness into a weapon wielded against them. The creature's power grows precisely because it exploits this physiological fragility, turning their survival instincts into mechanisms of self-destruction. Now shift focus to how the internal landscape of each survivor becomes a battleground for conflicting impulses. When faced with relentless psychological assault, some might instinctively seek escape, driven by a primal desire to flee from their suffering. Yet, paradoxically, attempting to outrun their fears often deepens their entrapment, as the environment responds by morphing into a more complex, labyrinthine trap. Others may attempt to confront their inner darkness directly, pressing into their most painful memories or shameful truths. In doing so, they risk overwhelming their fragile sanity, as the confrontation may unearth trauma too deep to contain. This internal tug-of-war emphasizes that the experience isn't merely about external threats, but about how each mind chooses to navigate its own chaos. Every choice, every retreat into denial or act of bravado inadvertently feeds the creature's hunger for emotional energy. Another crucial layer is how the creature's influence exposes the fragility of moral boundaries under extreme duress. When survival is at stake, the survivor's ethical filters become porous, revealing primal instincts buried beneath societal norms. Now consider how desperation can justify heinous acts, betrayal, deception, even violence, since the stakes seem to transcend morality itself. The environment's relentless psychological pressure erodes their restraint, forcing them into decisions they might have previously condemned. This descent into moral ambiguity underscores a brutal truth. Under the weight of infinite dread, the veneer of civility fades, exposing a raw primal core that is easier to manipulate. Every choice becomes a moral compromise, feeding into their internal guilt and shame, which the creature then exploits to intensify its hold. It's a vicious cycle where the boundary between right and wrong blurs, illustrating how fragile human morality truly is when confronted with unrelenting terror. Finally, consider how the survivor's internal defenses, denial, suppression, rationalization, become their own undoing. When faced with overwhelming darkness, many instinctively attempt to shield themselves by shutting out their fears, locking away painful truths behind barricades of willpower. Yet within this mental fortress, a paradox emerges. The act of repression often magnifies the creature's power. Repressed fears don't vanish. Instead, they simmer beneath the surface, waiting for the right trigger to erupt. The temples. Influence makes this process inevitable. Each suppressed emotion becomes a dormant volcano, ready to spew forth in moments of vulnerability, often triggered by the environment's manipulations. Now consider how this mirrors real-world scenarios, how ignoring a problem only allows it to fester and intensify, eventually bursting out uncontrollably. The creature's design reveals that ignoring internal darkness is not an act of strength, but a setup for catastrophe. as unresolved fears gain potency and become the fuel for their own destruction. This exposure emphasizes that true resilience involves not avoidance, but acceptance, facing the shadow, no matter how horrifying, lest it grow beyond control and consume everything in its path, including the survivor's very identity. Drawing these threads together, we see a complex tapestry where the boundaries between internal darkness and external horrors blur into an indistinguishable frontier. The entire landscape becomes less a static environment and more a living reflection of the fragile, often fractured psyche of those trapped within it. The environment, with its shifting corridors and distorted perceptions, acts as a mirror, an unsettlingly malleable surface that reveals not only the fears lurking beneath, but also the raw vulnerability that each survivor attempts to conceal. As the space itself responds to their internal chaos, it underscores a profound truth. The greatest terrors are often not separate entities, but manifestations of the unresolved, unacknowledged fears we carry deep within. These fears, when left unexamined, mutate into demons that feed not merely on our screams, but on the very essence of our despair and self-doubt. In this convergence, the internal and external worlds become inseparable, each feeding the other in a relentless cycle of erosion. The environment's capacity to reflect and distort internal truths amplifies the sense that reality itself is a fragile construct, one that can shatter at any moment under the weight of unspoken dread. The creature's insidious influence reveals that true power lies in the manipulation of perception and emotion, a process that turns the mind into both a battleground and a weapon. Here, the distinctions between what is real and what is imagined dissolve, leaving only an ambiguous space where the mind's defenses are tested to their breaking point. As the labyrinthine corridors twist and fold, they serve as a metaphor for the internal maelstrom raging within each survivor, an endless, often uncontrollable descent into the depths of their own fears. In light of these insights, the path forward becomes less about seeking external salvation and more about confronting the internal landscape with unwavering honesty, however unsettling that journey may be. The process of facing one's darkness is akin to navigating an intricate maze built from the very fabric of one's subconscious, an endeavor that demands a delicate balance of courage and surrender. The realization that internal vulnerabilities are not merely weaknesses, but gateways to understanding and resilience shifts the narrative from one of simple survival to one of profound engagement with the self. It suggests that the true challenge resides in accepting the unchangeable truths buried beneath layers of denial, and in recognizing that these truths, once acknowledged, possess the power to either destroy or transform. This synthesis of the internal and external, the perception and reality, beckons us to reconsider what it means to confront darkness, whether it lurks behind a shadowed corridor or within the unspoken corners of our minds. The forces that manipulate perception and feed on despair exemplify how fragile the human spirit can be when subjected to relentless assault. Yet they also illuminate a crucial paradox: that the act of facing one's fears, of daring to peer into the void, may be the only way to find a sliver of clarity amid chaos. The labyrinth is not merely a trap, but a crucible, an arena where the most vulnerable aspects of the self are laid bare, tested, and ultimately forged into something resilient or shattered beyond repair.